Hello and welcome to Beholden To Truth. It is your humble host, Joshua, here with you for a very, very special episode today. We are in celebration mode because a moment we have been waiting for years now. If you guys have been following my platform, Beholden To Truth, whether it was on YouTube, Rumble, Instagram, Twitch, Substack, all the various platforms, we have been waiting for the America First movement to finally make it into the mainstream. But in order for that to happen, you have to have mainstream political commentators and entertainers and so on platform the leaders of the America First movement. And the obvious figurehead of America First, of the show called America First, would be Nick Fuentes. And it's no secret that Nick has been scapegoated to the outskirts of human society, not just the internet, for the last 7-8 years. And this is directly tied to the ideologies and the priorities that he conveys on his show, America First. And those are simply summarized by trying to protect the identity of America and make sure America remains a sovereign nation run by Americans, but also that American identity is inextricably tied to the people who found the country and their faith. The mixture of European people who came and settled this land and inherited the Greco-Roman Empire, the ways of its government, its philosophies, even its architecture, its arts, its languages, and so on. And also, obviously, their faith, the Christian faith. And so when we try to insist that these two shoulders that we stood ourselves up on be protected and not changed over time, not the demographic, not the religious fabric, we have to identify what the counter forces are against the demographic and against the faith. And as you do that deep dive analysis, as Nick stumbled upon 8 years ago and everybody else who has gone deeply down the rabbit hole, you start to learn some things about the highest tiers of society in the elite civil institutions, the government, the media, finance, and the education system. You start looking at who the leadership class are of all of those civil institutions and what their ethnic background is or what their religious affiliation is. And oftentimes, if they have dual loyalty to a foreign nation, and you start to find a pretty disturbing trend, which is that there are a highly, highly disproportionate number of Jews in all four of those civil institutions. Whether or not they are religious Jews, whether or not they have an outspoken affiliation with Israel or that it is implied because they are Jewish, but all of them are ethnically Jewish. And so as you start to add up just the sheer nature of this disproportionate representation and how often they have a loyalty to a foreign nation and how often they are anti-Christian in their beliefs and how often they are highly nepotistic towards Jews in America, Jews in Israel, and Jews worldwide, we start to see that these things are a conflict of interest to the Christian European identity of this country. And so as America First as a movement has grown from a grassroots, bottoms up endeavor, it has been very difficult for that message to reach the mainstream with unbelievable amounts of censorship, unbelievable amounts of suppression, unbelievable amounts of gatekeeping by the people who are paid and promoted to make sure that the narrative that the people in control of those civil institutions is protected. They can't have a disruption to that narrative and their agenda. And so people who are highly well-spoken, articulate in history and in religion and politics and economics, when they come and have a problem with the narrative or a problem with the leadership class of the nation, those people have to be scapegoated to the outskirts of society, especially the various forms of media, so that their ideas don't gain popularity. And so Nick has been struggling for the last 8 years to break through that censorship and suppression. And he's been trying to get platformed by anybody in the mainstream, not even asking them to agree with him, but simply to talk to him publicly, have them on their shows, host an intellectual debate. If his ideas are so awful and so obviously incorrect, then theoretically anybody should be able to debate him in a public forum and destroy his ideas. But nobody has been willing to do so. And so now, just last week, none other than Candace Owens invited him on her show. And we all know last year, Candace Owens had her departure from Daily Wire. And she went on to stand up her independent journalism outlet on X and, of course, her website. And as she did that, free from the suppression of the Daily Wire and Ben Shapiro and Jeremy Boring, she started to become more outspokenly critical of Israel and even at times condemned individual Jews and the Jewish culture of censorship and protectionism and nepotism. And so there seemed to be a pretty obvious confluence, or at least a hopeful confluence of people forming with large audiences that hopefully we could work together on this problem. Candace, Nick, Dan Blitzerian, Andrew Tate, Jake Shields, E. Michael Jones. There's plenty of people who have talked about these issues, but still they are gatekept from the mainstream. And so for now, Candace to finally, after many, many years of petitioning from the internet cohort, has platformed Nick on her show. And I watched the 2-hour interview last night, and I have a very thorough set of feedback and comments about some of the conversations had during that interview that I'm going to share with you today. I'm looking forward to doing it. It's going to be a little bit of a longer session, so get comfortable. I have a lot of thoughts about it, some things that I was really happy to hear Nick talk about on such a large platform. Some praise for Candace, obviously, for being willing to have the conversation, and also some criticisms of both of them, where there were questions that I think Nick probably could have answered better, and there were grievances of my own with Candace Owens and how she conducted a couple of the talking points. And so we're going to get into all of that. I hope you guys are excited. I know I am. So without further ado, I'll kind of go through chronologically how the interview went down, and I'll be providing bullet points on each of the chapters, so to speak.
The destruction of human freedom. But like every one of the superstates that preceded it, it has one iron rule. Logic is an enemy and truth is a menace.
So the first 20 minutes, we're actually not going to spend that much on, because the first 20 minutes were devoted to Candace allowing Nick to simply share his life story and his ascendancy as a political commentator, how he built the America First platform, where its name came from, what he went through in college, what he went through in trying to get mainstream, working for Right Side Broadcasting Network, and trying to get a job at Daily Wire and being groomed to be the next up and coming star in conservative politics. And then how things went sideways, basically the moment that he started to inquire into America's relationship with Israel. And so I'm not going to rehash all of that. If you would like to see Nick's backstory, he does that plenty of times on his own platform, or of course you can watch Candace's show. But I'm just pointing out that the first 20 minutes or so of the interview, it was largely speaking to Nick being essentially smothered in the cradle, where he was an 18-year-old man and he had people as powerful as Ben Shapiro himself calling to have him shut down and his voice suppressed, hit job articles written about him being banned from the largest social media platforms, payment processors being taken away, making it difficult for him to make money to invest in his platform and simply make a living, being kicked out of college, losing friends, the list goes on and on. So that was really the first 20 minutes of the interview. Where we want to get into a bit of a deeper analysis is some of the questions that were asked and the answers that were provided. And so once Nick finally gets beyond the introduction of who he is and how his path got him to where he is and how he became this most censored man in America, allegedly evil, anti-Semite, racist, misogynist, bigot, all of that stuff, before all the slander and all that, Nick goes through his learning of how deep this problem goes. And so he kind of provided a high-level summary of that I want to quickly walk through with you, where maybe you went through this same kind of life cycle yourself. I know I certainly did. At some point in time in your life, you probably heard a conspiracy theory that the Jews run the banks, the Jews run Hollywood, the Jews are super powerful, the Jews did 9/11, the Jews, XYZ, something controversial, something not positive about the Jews. And everybody typically has a gag reflex to hearing about these things. They don't even want to entertain the thought. They really just want to dismiss it as a conspiracy theory. They don't want to think about large groups of people as potentially working against the best interest of the American people. They don't want to think of them as actively hostile to our ancestors or our faith or anything like that. And so it's easiest to just dismiss the whole thing and say, well, so what? Even if it was true that there are a lot of people in banking that are Jewish, or okay, so what if it is true that a lot of Hollywood is run by Jewish people? Who cares? What does that matter? They're hardworking people. They're intelligent. We live in a country of meritocracy. So as long as they worked hard and they express their intelligence, then honestly, that's the American dream. They deserve to be successful. And if they end up with a disproportionate number of the most influential roles in those various institutions, then we shouldn't interpret that as a bad thing. And this is really where the critical thinking stops. And I wouldn't even describe that as critical thinking. That's just trying to come up with the simplest excuse to not have to have the conversation of, even if I'm willing to accept that Hollywood and banking, and most people don't know quite as much about the level of disproportionate representation of Jews in the government or in academia, but it is equally as high, if not more. Actually going further into that conversation and dissecting why it might matter that a disproportionate number of the people who sculpt the information diet, whether it's the legacy media or the new media, social media, digital platforms, and so on, having to go into why that would even matter, or why would it matter that there's a lot of Jews in the government, or why would it matter that the Jews have a disproportionate representation in banking or in the Ivy League schools, and so on. Most people simply do not do the critical analysis of why it would matter if it were even true. And if you are told that maybe if you do that analysis, why it matters, if you come to a conclusion that this is in a conflict of interest to Christian American people or America as a nation, then there can't possibly be a rational explanation for you seeing that as a negative thing. It must be some kind of irrational hatred of Jews, anti-Semitism. But Nick goes through a couple of things. So the first layer that he talks about is the immediate gag reflex of, even if you wanted to do the research, if you wanted to actually start counting up the number of how many Jews are in banking, the government, academia, media, the gag reflex that the education system, the government, and the media, coincidentally, have all programmed us with is to say, that sounds a lot like something Hitler did. That sounds a lot like something Nazis did. And we all know Nazis and Hitler are synonymous with the Holocaust. We all know the Holocaust was the systemic murdering genocide of Jews, 6 million of them, so we're told. And so that is supposed to emotionally shut you down from entertaining any kind of research or critical thought into if it's even true that these Jews are disproportionately represented in these various institutions. And so there's the social stigma around looking at the Jewish religion, looking at the nation of Israel, that is the Jewish nation, or even the ethnicity of the Jews in any kind of critical fashion. The social stigma that we all know is called anti-Semitism, it's likened to Nazis and Hitler. That's the first repulsion that we all feel. That's the first layer that has been constructed as a bubble of irreproach around all Jewish people, religious or not, living in Israel or anywhere else. We all know that that's the first layer to stop you from going further, because nobody wants those labels attributed to them, not just because we don't want to feel like bad people. We don't want to be called Nazis and Hitler and so on. But also, we know if you have the public label of being an anti-Semite or a Nazi, a white supremacist, or any of this other nonsense, but those labels represent a very, very real and tangible risk to your personal life, your career, your romantic life, your friend circles, your church circles, romantic opportunities. To be known as an anti-Semite is a social curse. It is, as I said, a very high risk to every part of your personal life. You can lose your career overnight with an accusation of anti-Semitism, right? You can lose your church relationships. You can be kicked out of the church. You're not welcome here if you're an anti-Semite. You can certainly never run for any kind of political office if you are a known anti-Semite. And so this is an intentional thing. The Jews, when they're being honest, there's plenty of videos of them talking about this. how they have constructed this bullying tactic of labeling anybody who ever criticizes them in any fashion. As I said, the religion, the ethnic nepotism, the nation of Israel, as an anti-Semite, because they know that's do not pass go, do not collect $200, and it creates a chilling effect. They basically martyr you and crucify you so that everybody sees you dangling up there from the cross. They see your ruined reputation and your ruined career, your ruined life, and that gives you pause to ever say a single word, even if you did the research. Even if you fact check some things and came to find out that this disproportionate representation actually is very real. And there's some historical circumstances that have been exaggerated in relation to the Holocaust and other historical events. There are historical receipts that have been suppressed, such as Jewish terrorism in the founding of Israel, such as Israel's deception and backstabbing of America. We can go through all the receipts, but that's not the intent of this episode. I want to keep it focused on the interview itself. I'm simply speaking to the first layer that they have concocted that has kept this topic, Jewish influence, suppressed for your entire life. And then the second layer that Nick talks about is, let's just say you're going to go down this rabbit hole and you're going to do some investigation just to independently fact check it yourself. You're not out there talking about it publicly because you know the risks of doing so, but at least you would like to do your own independent research. You don't want to just trust what Hollywood and what CNN and Fox News and the New York Times say about Jews. You want to do some of your own research. Well, it's actually quite difficult to get the facts about the history of the Jews, anything that would portray them in a critical or negative fashion. And Nick speaks to this, and I've spoken to this in previous vlogs, where if you simply try to go and do any kind of analysis objectively about the Holocaust or Jewish terrorism and things like this, Jewish influence in our government, Jewish influence in the media, any of these things will immediately get flagged in your search query on Google, and the results will come back asymmetrically to inflate and bubble up results that say, oh, that's a conspiracy theory. All that is just stuff anti-Semites say. And so when you go to the mainstream search engines, obviously Google is the most used search engine in America. If you're trying to do research, trusting that the search engine is going to be able to inform you and give you a neutral, unbiased, objective analysis of everybody's viewpoints, then you can't even get to the information via search engines. And so if you then wanted to go and try to do some research on perhaps social media or the video platforms, if you didn't know that all of those platforms, almost all of them, are owned by Jews, and therefore they get to construct the algorithm of how results are served to you, what information is suppressed, what information is outright banned from being circulated. You have Mark Zuckerberg obviously owning Facebook, and he appointed another Jew to run Instagram. You had Susan Wojcicki running YouTube for 10 years. Both of the founders of Google are Jewish. You have AI. Now we think, okay, it's search engines, it's also the video platforms, but maybe I can query ChatGPT to get some information about this topic. Lo and behold, Sam Altman, founder of OpenAI, also Jewish. And then you say, okay, well, maybe I could go to like a publicly sourced Wikipedia kind of situation where I can get a unbiased perspective based on and populated by whoever wants to contribute. Theoretically, that would be unbiased too, right? Well, then you have the former prime minister of Israel, Naftali Bennett. He's on camera talking about how he hosts seminars in Israel for Jews to learn how to manipulate and obscure results and obfuscate any topics as it relates to Jews, whether it's Zionism, Judaism, the founding of Israel, historical events like the Nakba, historical events like JFK's assassination and linking that to the Mossad and Israel's influence, stuff like AIPAC, stuff like the USS Liberty. It's not easy to find those results on the mainstream search platforms. You'll get a high-level description of the event, but conspicuously missing will be the ties to the Mossad or Israel or Jews in America who advocated for these things or helped suppress these things. And so just the sheer nature and difficulty of getting down to the objective facts about Jewish influence and Jewish interests creates a second layer of making the independent research all the more difficult. Now, that was like the first 20, 30 minutes of the conversation. Nick's ascendancy, his background, his censorship and suppression, and then the nature of the problem with the public social stigma around it. And then when you try to do your own research, all of the tools that we use to research, the video platforms, search engines, AI, Wikipedia, all being groomed and tailored to give you pro-Jewish results only makes the problem worse. And so Nick described all of that in the interview, which I thought was very important for the mainstream to hear.
Beholden to truth, Christ culture, white identity, and fitness lifestyle. Red pilling the masses. On the front lines. Against the synagogue of Satan. Expose the Zog. And save Europa by shopping at beholdentotruth.com. We need everyone supporting the mission of bringing Satan to submission.
Next up in the interview, they spent a solid 30 minutes, in my opinion, a bit too much time, because this kind of tied more to a beef between Nick and Candace. They got to squabbling over their mutual friendship of a guy named Dave Smith, who is a Jewish comedian who has decided to lean pretty heavily into political commentary and especially criticizing Israel and their ongoing ethnocide in Palestine. And so Dave Smith has been platformed on the mainstream conservative circuit commentators, whether it's Joe Rogan, Candace Owens, Piers Morgan, and plenty of others, to talk about the ongoing conflict between Israel and Palestine and America's support for that. And this tied to Nick's grievance of he not being allowed to be platformed by any of the very same political commentators who are allegedly Christian, allegedly America first. It was a little odd that the figurehead to talk about being anti-Israel in this specific case of this specific war, that the most popular authorized opinion maker on this topic was Jewish. And so Nick was saying he kind of felt like Dave Smith was picked as a token Jew to have a conversation finally at last about Israel's influence in America. The AIPAC and the lobbying up and down our Congress and the White House. It's even at the state level as well, governors, district attorneys, even mayors. And so Dave Smith being platformed to talk about all of these things, in Nick's opinion, was a strategic move by many of these platforms to make the conversation a bit more palatable and to get ahead of any accusations of anti-Semitism, because what are they going to say? If you have a Jew on talking about how he is critical of Israel, then they can't say, well, you're anti-Semitic. Well, Dave Smith is a Jew and I had him on my show and he feels this way, so I can't be anti-Semitic. And so Nick referred to that as tokenism. It's a lot like when you have somebody like Jason Whitlock or Candace Owens or some other Black commentator talking about Black crime or Black Lives Matter. They are able to do so without all the accusations of racism because they are Black. And so you'll see this all the time in conservative politics, where it's the token Black person who is allowed to go hard on the Black community without all of these accusations and labels of racism. Dave Smith is brought on as the token Jew to go hard on the Israel problem. That way they can avoid the accusations of anti-Semitism. It's a pretty straightforward argument, and I think Nick is valid in pointing that out, because there are plenty of people who are anti-Israel and have been talking about it for decades, or at least 5 to 10 years, and those people were not the ones being picked to talk about this. It was the guy who showed up only recently condemning Israel because this particular war has been so atrocious, so many war crimes, so impossible to ignore that, okay, it finally has to be talked about in the mainstream. So who are we going to allow to talk about it? We should probably pick a Jew. Now, Candace refuted, saying, well, Dave Smith is a personal friend of mine. I'd had him on my show ever since Daily Wire, and so it had nothing to do with the fact that he was Jewish as to why I picked him and why I didn't pick you. And this kind of cracked open a conversation where Nick said, okay, you're kind of starting in the middle of the story, because it's not just this one thing. It's also the fact that you agreed to have me on your show multiple years ago and then you never did it. And we know that the audience really wanted me to be on your show for us to do a collaboration when you started talking about the Jews, because everybody knows Nick has been talking about this for 8 years, and he's the most credible source in terms of knowing and being able to elaborate with all of the names, dates, receipts, and so on, how widespreading this problem is. And because Candace was first beginning to talk about these things in the aftermath of Kanye's outburst last year, when he said that the Jews created cancel culture, she stood by Kanye West when he was being attacked, when the ADL came after him, when he lost his $1.5 billion in business contracts with Adidas and Gap, and the recording studios wouldn't allow him to record, and Fox News had their documentary with him canceled. And there was just a very large, obvious campaign conducted by the Jews who run this country to destroy Kanye's life. And to Candace's credit, she stood by Kanye. And so Nick at that time was actually very vocally supportive of Candace Owens, even calling himself Standus Owens. And he called the Groypers to support Candace. And he saw the opportunity of the confluence of understanding that this Jewish thing is getting more airtime. It's becoming more obvious. And I am the authority on this subject. It's probably best now to reach out and see if she's willing to have me on the show. But she did not do that. And so it becomes a 30-minute back and forth where they're talking about, well, I didn't really know that you wanted to be on my show. You could have just sent me a more explicit message saying you wanted me to be on my show. And then Nick says, well, you said you would have me on your show in the live chat when you were doing your show. And then after that, you said, actually, I've never had any communication with Nick at all. And that Nick points out, well, that wasn't true. We talked twice before. You reached out to me once in regards to your husband and his company, Parlor. And we also intersected in relation to Kanye West. And so when you said publicly that I have never spoken to Nick before, that was a lie. And so this is where I say it got into 30 minutes of a little bit of mudslinging. You could say it was all miscommunication and, okay, that's not exactly what I meant by never spoke to you. Yes, technically we talked, but we didn't sit around talking about issues or anything like that. So they try to squash the beef for like 30 straight minutes. But as they go through that squashing of the beef, Nick points out something very important that I think everybody needed to hear, which is this concept of a limited hangout, which is kind of what I was describing before with Dave Smith being promoted as the figurehead for talking about being Israel critical. It is only because the establishment, and I'm talking about figures as large as Joe Rogan, the single largest podcast in the world, when they realized the war crimes going on in Israel with America's support were very unpopular, they have to essentially have some kind of pressure release valve and allow the conversation to happen to some extent without it boiling over. And so they got to find who it is that we're going to allow to talk about this, that we can trust to not divulge the whole situation, to not go too far on it. And so this concept is called a limited hangout. It's a CIA tactic. You can look it up on Wikipedia, where they are forced to confess at least part of the truth, but there is still an intentional withholding of all of the facts. And this was true. You saw this especially with like the JFK assassination. You see this with various conspiracy theories. You saw it with the Epstein files, and it's currently happening with Israel and the Jews, where now it seems to be okay. Even last night, I just saw Tucker Carlson at a Turning Point USA event, who is funded by Israel, who sends its Turning Point USA ambassadors to Israel to tour Holocaust museums and to go and hump the Wailing Wall and get taught by a rabbi about the historical persecution of Jews. Tucker Carlson was at a Turning Point USA event just last night talking about how the Epstein files are obviously implicating Israel and the Mossad in being in bed with our government, blackmailing our politician, blackmailing our leaders of industry. in the sciences, in the media, in academia, everywhere, in the banking, obviously. And so Tucker, also a controlled opposition CIA agent, it is his responsibility to successfully manage the limited hangout of the Jewish question, to make sure that the gates are tightly drawn around. This whole problem is a problem tied to the foreign nation of Israel. And it is because they are a foreign nation, that is why we have a problem with it. It has nothing to do with them being Jewish. And it has nothing to do with other Jewish people who aren't necessarily living in Israel. This is a matter of a foreign nation having too much influence in our country, especially their intelligence agencies, but also how they drag us into these wars, how they lobby our politicians to advocate for more foreign aid and various things that are Israel's interest, but maybe not the best interest of America. That's where Tucker's position is. And that's because it is his job to make sure that this doesn't become a conversation at a larger scale about Jewish influence, the Jewish religion, the history of Jews, it being anti-European and obviously anti-Christian. And so that is the same reason why Dave Smith was promoted in what you would call promoted opposition. He's not necessarily working for the opposition, meaning literally controlled opposition, but there is a subject called promoted opposition, where the opposition knows there are certain people that they can not necessarily give orders to, but if somebody's going to talk about this issue, we should promote them, and they should not promote somebody like Nick Fuentes. And that is the exact nature of Dave Smith, Tucker Carlson, and many of the others in the mainstream conservative circuit who are now talking about Israel. It may not be that they're necessarily directly taking orders from our opposition, but the opposition knows that promoting them keeps the conversation tightly drawn around this foreign nation that has too much influence and away from subjects that, as Nick Fuentes would articulate, that this is actually about Jewish influence, a fifth column in the United States that advocates for its ethnic people worldwide, in Israel, in America, in Europe, everywhere that they are. And they have cultural priorities that are anti-Christian at an ethnic level and religious level. And they have cultural priorities that are anti-European, including forced immigration and diversity and multiculturalism. Those are things that are inextricably tied to Jewish culture. And so this fifth column, as they both call it, is what really needs to be talked about. The fifth column does have an allegiance to Israel, and Israel does have an obvious disproportionate role in our government's priorities, whether that's through blackmail or classic tactics of just financial lobbying. It is a much larger problem than that. And so Nick talked through all of that. He explained the nature of a limited hangout, and I just explained the nature of promoted opposition versus outright controlled opposition, and the tokenism that was employed with Dave Smith. Like you said, you can use the same analogy with a black person being allowed to talk about black crime or that DEI is stupid. And so Candace said, maybe you're a little too conspiratorial. Maybe you live on the internet a little bit too much, because when I brought Dave Smith on my show, it wasn't because I was thinking, oh, he's not going to talk about the whole Jewish problem. He's going to keep it to Israel, and that keeps my platform safe. Because that's kind of the subtle accusation that Nick was making. And that's definitely the true accusation Nick has made with Joe Rogan and everybody else who has platformed Dave Smith, people like Piers Morgan. And so Candace's argument was you shouldn't necessarily attribute malice or deception or Machiavellianism, where sometimes it is just a disagreement. Maybe some people just don't believe that there is a larger Jewish problem. Or it could be as simple as, I like Dave Smith as a guy. I trust him. I've talked to him before. I've done interviews with him before. And so that's why I picked him to talk about these issues. And so possibly that's true. Could be, we're not living in Candace's head. We're not trying to call her a liar. That's just the nature of the back and forth in the interview that they had. And Candace also pointed out that with the way she's running her platform, which has been pretty obvious for a long time, you can't just go and dump a bucket of truth ice water on everybody and wake them up overnight. You can't just puke out the whole 12 hours of Europa, the Last Battle, for example, and go straight from somebody who has been watching Fox News their whole life to now they know about the entire problem of Europa falling apart, Western civilization falling apart, whites being replaced in their countries. Obviously, Jewish people have a very, very large role in that. They admit this. People like Barbara Lerner Specter, people like Larry Fink, George Soros, the NGOs they have created, the transnational corporations and groups that they have created, the United Nations, World Economic Forum, and the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, all these Jewish advocacy groups for immigration. The Jews are inextricably tied to immigration, and it's for multiple reasons. It helps them camouflage in whatever nation that they are occupying, as for one, but it also helps to deracinate the nation that they are living in so that it is less fiercely attached to its historic identity. So the bucket of ice water that Candace mentioned, I have had a conversation about this many times where I talk about there being different ranks in the army, where the mission is to get the truth out, that Jewish influence is a problem and that white people being a minority in their own country is unacceptable. And it's actually extremely dangerous to the fate of the nation and white people. That's the bucket of ice water that everybody needs to have dumped on themselves as soon as possible. But that's called a conspiracy theory. Both the Jewish influence, obviously, and the Great Replacement theory is a white nationalist, white supremacist, Nazi KKK conspiracy theory. And so if you try to hit them with the full truth of that, and I can throw out all those names, Larry Fink, George Soros, Barbara Lerner Specter, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, I can lay out all those things, but most people can't validate those receipts even when I say them. They've never done their research. They don't know who those people are or what those organizations are, what they stand for. And they're frankly not that interested in going and validating them because they're busy. They're doing other things. They're going to their kids' sports games. They're working 40 hours a week. They're going grocery shopping. They're hooked on Netflix. They're hooked on going to see Hollywood movies. They're trying to follow Beyonce around the country on tour. And so trying to get people to the cold, hard truth that there is a fifth column of Jews subverting America's historic identity as a European Christian nation, and white genocide being a real problem that is urgent, that must be talked about, trying to get them there in one conversation where you just puke the whole truth on them, that bucket of cold ice water can, in a lot of times, actually turn them off of the subject and make them somewhat afraid of you, see you as a dangerous person. And so Candace somewhat makes the argument that laying out the breadcrumbs, exposing these truths over time, maybe that's the more tactical play. Maybe that's the better long-term winning strategy. Nick is obviously of the opposite camp. And this is why I've always loved Nick. And this has always been the strategy that I have emulated, where my position is we don't have time. We genuinely don't have time. In 20 years, whites will be a minority in America. Whites are already the minority among newborns in this country. Whites have a negative birth rate. Simultaneous to that, millions of non-white people are being flooded into every white nation of the world. We all know that this is going to be a problem in the future, and it is a civilizational problem. The economics of the country will no longer work. Just go and look at who creates the revenue in this country. Go and look at who creates the technical innovation in this country. Go and look at who has secured our safety via our military tactics. Go and look at who created the education system and established the curriculum. None of these things came from the Muslim community. None of them came from the African community, nor the Hindu Indian community, nor the Hispanic community. These are all legacies and inheritances of the European people. And especially as the religious fabric in the country changes to be more agnostic, atheist, Muslim, Hindu, everything else, things are only going to get worse. These are urgent problems. And so we don't have time to say, okay, we're going to drop this one little truth about the USS Liberty, and I'll talk to you again next week about some other completely unrelated to the Jewish influence problem. And in 3 weeks, I'm going to give you one more clue about Jewish influence. Did you know that the Clinic for Transgender Studies was founded by a guy named Magnus Hirschfeld, who was Jewish in Weimar, Germany? Did you know that? Okay, I'll see you again in 3 or 4 more weeks where we'll talk about the origins of feminism and Gloria Steinem, the Jew, being a CIA agent. and feminism having its roots in Talmudism. And then I'll see you in 3 more weeks and we'll talk about whatever else you want to talk about. The overwhelming majority of leaders of the Federal Reserve, oh, they happen to be Jewish. Maybe in 3 more weeks, we'll talk about who created all these search engines and AI engines and video platforms. You know, we don't have time to drop one breadcrumb every 3 weeks to make sure we're not doing it too much, lest we be called anti-Semite. That's the Candace Owens strategy. We don't have time for that. We need to be accelerating. And that's not an acceleration towards violence. Obviously, I have to disclaim that because I don't promote that. Like Candace and like Nick, I am a Christian. I believe that there are peaceful, moral solutions to these problems, but they have to be talked about with urgency and with full facts. The breadth and scope of the problem has to be talked about at length, unapologetically, emphatically. And so that's the camp Nick and myself and others are in. Candace is much more slow walking it. Careful, we don't want to be too offensive. We don't want to insinuate too much. I don't want to dump a bucket of cold water on anybody. And so they have different methods of waking people up. And you can attribute nefarious motivations for that. You can say, well, listen, Candace is a multimillionaire and has been for a very long time. And she's had millions of followers for a very long time. And so she knows there is a substantial risk to losing all of that. Lawsuits, lawfare, reputational assassination, character assassination, all of those things that she knew back when she first started dabbling in these waters, if she kept going in that trajectory, she knew she could stand to lose all those things. She saw it happen to her good friend Kanye West. If she'd done any research, she knows that this is the nature of the situation with anybody who publicly identifies the breadth and scope of Jewish influence. And so I just honestly don't believe that it was I'm going to play 6-dimensional chess and really slowly walk out these receipts and maybe people will put it together on their own. I'm going to point to one star in the sky of the constellation this week. And then in a couple weeks, I'll point to one other star. And in 2 more, I'll point to one other star. And after, 12 weeks, we'll have 6 different points of the constellation. And maybe people will notice at that point that those 6 points form the star of Remphan. Yeah, sorry, Candace, I'm just not buying that. I think it was a lot more about trying to protect your reputation, your wealth, your status, your influence. And I think Nick knows that. And he didn't call her to the floor on that, but that's honestly the truth. That's what needs to be said. But she's a new mom and she already was suffering from a lot of disruptions in her family life. And so that's why she's been tiptoeing around these things and prioritizing talking about Bridget Marcone actually being a man. Okay, so we that's the thing. Those who follow Nick, we know what's going on with that, but Nick didn't necessarily want to create a big fuss of it during the interview. And so they just kind of moved through that conversation. They talked about the bucket of ice water, so to speak.
You can help save Europa by getting the message out to the masses and also support this platform by shopping at BeholdenToTruth.com.
And then they go through, another 15 minutes of litigating how long it took to have Nick on the show and when she originally first found out about him, if she said that she would have him on the show, but then reneged on that. If so, why? Was she tied up in these legal matters that prohibited it? Was it just a slip of the mind? Is it Nick's fault because he didn't ask her explicitly, hey, I would like to be on your show next week? They went through more of litigating that. He went over what the Groyper War was and who Groypers are. So this is back in the 20-teens where Nick's following went to events like Turning Point USA and other conservative Young Americans for Freedom kind of events. And his followers would confront people like Matt Walsh and Charlie Kirk and ask them far-right positions such as about gay marriage, such as about the USS Liberty, such as about the dancing Israelis, such as white genocide. And he would press them on these topics where, you say that you're a Christian, but you're going on a public speaking tour with a man who is gay married. You say that you're against immigration, but you support H-1B visas. You say that America must be a country founded on Christian values, but we have a foreign country meddling in our government who is not Christian. We have a institution, the media, who is not run by Christians. Can we identify maybe who is running it? Because maybe that would explain how or why so much of their content is anti-Christian. Really being transgressive and pressing the envelope of what it means to be genuinely conservative. These young kids, teenagers, early 20s, were going and asking these well-known mainstream conservative commentators these questions at public events, and it was very awkward for them. It's a great compilation of videos you should pursue in your own time. And so that was the Groyper War, and Groypers are those people who follow America First, who see Nick as the head of America First, and essentially are the foot soldiers of America First. One interesting thing that Candace confessed during this interview was when she was being attacked by the Anti-Defamation League and other Jewish organizations for supporting Kanye and having a couple of conversations, and about the rabbi who owns a sex toy shop with his daughter who is meddling in governmental politics, Rabbi Shmuley. She had an interview with him. I believe it was on Piers Morgan. I can't remember which platform it was, but she condemned him and talked about how that is obviously anti-Christian and that Christians don't have any obligation to support anything that isn't obviously Christian. And so there was this time where Candace was being attacked left, right, up, and down by various Jews, and they were trying to insinuate that she was affiliated with Nick Fuentes, that when she went out and said Christ is king, and she was told she was an anti-Semite for saying that by Rabbi Shmuley, by Jonathan Greenblatt of the ADL, and all of the other Jewish bully groups. They were calling her an anti-Semite for simply saying Christ is king. Now, she claims to not know that Christ is king as a political statement, not just a religious statement. Nick has said for years and years and years that the statement Christ is king, it is obviously a religious statement. It's what Christians believe. But it is inherently also a political statement because it is exclusionary. And Jews in particular take the most offense to the statement Christ is king because it is an inversion of their beliefs. Jesus Christ created significant problems for the Jews for the last 2,000 years. And so for us to come and say he is the king, he is sovereign over all human life, all of this world, he is the only truth, he is the only way to know God. Jews in particular, more so than atheists, pagans, Muslims, anybody else, have the biggest problem with the statement Christ is king. And so this is why you saw so many Jews attacking Candace Owens when she started adopting that vernacular when she was going through that debacle. Now, Nick has said during this interview that, I just thought it was a little conspicuous that suddenly you start talking about Israel and some loosely related Jewish subjects, the Bolshevik Revolution, their role in pornography, their role in feminism, and you're slowly painting that constellation for your followers, but you're not doing the bucket of ice water. And then you come out and start saying Christ is king. Okay, well, that's kind of my thing. I was saying that as a religious and political banner for America First for years. And so Nick had said on his show before that he felt like she was basically adopting a lot of his talking points and even his exact verbiage in terms of summarizing what we are standing for. And so Candace says, no, you're being too conspiratorial. You're on the internet too much. That's just how I felt. Christ is king. And so that I proclaimed that has nothing to do with hearing it from you. I wasn't even watching your show. Now she did confess that people she knows very closely watch his show. But she said that when people started linking her with Nick, she was really worried about this because she knew about Nick's reputation as a anti-Semite, racist, white supremacist, and so forth. And she started to think, she confessed this during the interview, and Nick didn't stop and pause on this, which I was a little surprised by. But she confessed, I told other people that you are a Fed. Now, Nick has said this about Tucker Carlson for a very long time, both that Tucker is a Fed, he is CIA. The receipts are there to prove that. But Tucker has gone on a whisper campaign. He's told Alex Jones and others that Nick is a Fed. that his role is to be an agitator, to whip up the white nationalist of the nation, to whip up the anti-Semites of the nation, to cause division. But for Candace to confess that she was also complicit in permeating that rumor that was very widespread throughout the last year that Nick is a Fed, apparently a lot of that was coming from Candace herself. So as I said, I was a little surprised that Nick didn't say, well, hold on. You were telling people I was a Fed? Thank you so much for that, because, that's not a great thing for my movement. The concept of Fed jacketing, it's on Wikipedia. You can look it up. This is classic CIA tactics. It's also called bad jacketing, where if there is somebody who represents a risk to the establishment or the regime, and they know full well that they're not a government employee, they are the government. They know who they employ, but they don't want people finding commonality and embracing those perspectives. And so they say, oh, that guy over there is a Fed. You can't trust him. And so that's what Tucker has been doing and insinuating about Nick for quite a while now. And to hear that Candace was also complicit in that rumor mill, very disappointing, Candace, gotta say. But that was just a small part of the interview that I noted. So the next part of the interview gets into what I was honestly most excited to hear about, because I knew the conversation was going to be pretty heavy on the Jewish topic. Most importantly, expanding that topic from the foreign nation of Israel to the fifth column, Jewish influence writ large, their ethnic nepotism, the conflicts of interest that creates with the ethnicity of the nation, their religious affiliation, how that obviously creates a conflict of interest with the religious fabric of the nation. After they got through all of that, after they talked through their personal beef about, you wouldn't have me on your show, well, you were calling me a Fed, all this other stuff, Candace goes to the racial subject, and that's where I'm very excited to dig in. The number one question you guys are asking me is, how can I wake people up? And you also ask, how can I help support you? And so I have a solution for both of those questions. You can head over to my Substack. You'll be able to get exclusive early access to all of my documentaries, my long format content, free ebooks, and even a chance to talk to me one-on-one. You can do Ask Me Anythings. There's several different membership options for your budget, whatever fits your lifestyle. Head on over and get yourself a subscription now.